Stand in the middle of a crowd and yawn. Watch what happens around you. Cough to draw a little attention to yourself, and then look sharply to your left. Again, watch what happens around you. Even more telling, take 4 friends. Go outside to where there's a busy street. All of you stop at the same time and look up to an empty window. What do you think will happen? American social psychologist Stanley Milgram worked with his colleagues to test precisely what happened in this situation. He asked groups of research Confederates to stop on a busy street and look up at a building, even though there was nothing there. This was a busy New York City street. He varied the size of the group, sometimes from 1 person to 2 or 3, up to actually 15 people. The experimenters, they got to watch, and they counted the percent of people walking by who also looked up at the building. When only 1 research Confederate stopped and looked, 40% of the people walking by looked. With 2, the percent went up to nearly 60%. Beginning with 5 and going up in group size, nearly 80% of the passers-by looked. Human beings are perceptive and social by nature, so we're constantly looking around and interpreting what those around us are doing, often without even being aware that we're doing it. We're also constantly trying to make sense of a confusing and uncertain world, and we use the behavior of others as a frequent guide. A yawn, for example, is quite contagious. Scientists aren't completely sure why, but the evidence is clear that upon seeing another person yawn, you're much more likely to yawn yourself. More often than not, responses like this occur in a click-whirr fashion. They happen quickly and are not controlled by any deliberate thought or planning. Yawning, looking up in the sky, blinking your eyes, folding your arms. People around us often influence our behavior outside of our awareness, and we naturally and unthinkingly mimic what they do. Of course, if you're aware that this happens, you can better understand yourself and others, and in a moment of influence, use that knowledge to your advantage. In this lecture, we will visit the context corner of the attic model. We'll discuss 3 contextual cues to which people naturally respond. When present, these cues dramatically affect how people are likely to be influenced. We'll use language crafted by Bob Cialdini, author of the best-selling book Influence, Science, and Practice. Cialdini refers to these 3 cues as scarcity, authority, and social proof. Let's begin with scarcity. In many situations, people do not know the actual worth of an object or an action. So if you're asked to purchase a brand new smartphone with features unlike anything on any other phone on the market for $500, you would not immediately know whether the phone is actually worth $500. Should you buy it? How do you figure out whether that's a good deal? One way that people do this is by looking at the context. How many of these phones are available? Is there a competition among people for them? Is there a line forming? If there are only a few phones and everyone seems to want one, then the phone is scarce. And a mental shortcut we all use is that scarce goods must be more valuable. So if a particular context creates scarcity, it cues us into action. Witness what happens in a live auction. On the block is a single white polyester suit. It garners attention, and 2 people keep raising their hands to outbid the other. Looking at each other, sizing each other up, they continue to raise their bids. In the end, the polyester suit sells for $145,000. Sounds like an unlikely scenario, right? Well, it really happened. The white suit in question was the one worn by John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever. And though $145,000 is a lot to pay for a dated piece of clothing, it was one of a kind. It was the one Travolta wore during filming. And the competition between bidders drove up the price. In describing this bidding contest in his book, Cialdini reported that the auctioneer was delighted and quite politic when describing the outcome. He simply noted, "Oh, that certainly is a record for polyester." Of course, that's not a record for an auction. Many individuals and companies opt to sell their goods and possessions at auctions. As long as they can get a good crowd there, then they can get competition. At Sotheby's art auctions, there are often multi-million-dollar prices on certain items. A piece by the American abstract artist Jackson Pollock, for example, fetched over $40 million. Now, not everyone is a fan of Pollock's unusual drip style of painting, but there are enough fans of his unique work and not enough original paintings to go around, especially because Pollock died in a car crash at the age of 44. For most of us, Sotheby's auctions are a bit outside of our price range, but we can witness more mundane examples of scarcity in the Black Friday sales that happen just after, well, now, in some cases, on Thanksgiving. With only a few items at sale prices, lines often form in advance, and people work hard to get those items, resorting at times to pushing, shoving, and name-calling. Often the same goods are available the day before and the day after for a price that really isn't that much different. But retailers take advantage of our natural instincts to value the scarce to get us moving. If a particular item is tagged limited availability, it must be valuable, right? This is when retailers, knowing how we interpret scarcity, turn this context into an influence tactic, and they get us to buy. By understanding and using contextual cues like scarcity, savvy marketers keep finding new ways to make us buy. A similar mechanism operates when a movie or book is banned. When a school district or watchdog group bans a particular item, it raises interest on the part of the public. It also sends a signal that this item may become restricted in supply and thus more valuable. For example, the Vatican condemned Sister Margaret A. Farley's 2006 book, Just Love, a framework for Christian sexual ethics. In her book, Farley wrote about human sexuality, gay marriage, and even masturbation. It was considered blasphemous by the Roman Catholic Church. After the ban, concerns were raised about how easy it would be to get a copy. The book quickly rose from number 142,982 on Amazon's overall sales ranking to number 16. It also became the #1 best-selling religious studies book for some time. Now, some of you might think that this is all about the racy title and the subject, but remember, the book had been out for some time, and sales had been mediocre. The spike in sales occurred after the ban. This has led some to call book banning the new Oprah effect, named after the boost in book sales that occurs when Oprah Winfrey selects a book for her reading club. Making something scarce can be just as powerful as an endorsement. There's another interesting angle to scarcity. The scholar James Chowning Davies has put forth a theory of political revolution that suggests scarcity plays an important role. Davies examined high-profile political revolutions in Russia, Egypt, and the United States, and developed what he calls the J-curve of revolution. This is when, following prolonged progress in the ability of citizens to acquire freedoms and goods, there's a reversal that creates a gap between expectations and reality. If you were plotting growth in freedoms and goods over time, there's a sudden dip, so it looks like the upside-down letter J. What happens following the dip can be considered in terms of scarcity, and that as freedoms become increasingly available, there are commensurate increases in optimism and hope. But with a reversal, those freedoms begin to feel threatened and potentially scarce. The fear of further reversals and even fewer freedoms in the future may be one of the forces that pushes people to come together, to raise arms and revolt, to fight to secure what suddenly feels scarce. So our first context cue that affects influence is scarcity. When something appears scarce, it seems more valuable, and people will act on it much as if its objective value was very high. Now, let's move on to discuss authority. At the top of this lecture, I mentioned the experiment Stanley Milgram conducted on the New York City sidewalks. In the 1960s, Milgram took the question of conformity and compliance even further. Given what had happened in Nazi Germany in the years before and during World War II, he wondered just how far people would go to comply with orders. He created an experiment, now very well known, where a research participant is asked by the experimenter to punish someone else with electrical shocks. How many people would comply? How many people would comply if the shocks were increased to nearly deadly levels? Let's talk about the experiment first, and then we'll talk about what Milgram and his students found. Upon arriving at the lab, a research participant would meet up with another person, and they would draw straws to see who plays the role of teacher and who plays the role of learner. In reality, the participant always ended up being the teacher, and the other person, the learner, was always a research confederate. The participant was asked to help the learner, that's the Confederate actor, memorize pairs of words. When the learner made a mistake recalling the correct word, the teacher was instructed to push a lever that delivered an electrical shock as punishment. As the learner made more mistakes, the teacher was instructed to deliver stronger and stronger shocks. The Confederate would always make mistakes, as planned by the experimenter, so the research participant was asked, in each experiment, to deliver increasingly powerful shocks. Now, in reality, there were no shocks, but the learners were trained actors. They acted quite convincingly as though the shocks were real. And as the shocks got more intense, the learner would begin to complain. Sometimes the participant would look at the experimenter and ask, should I go on? When this happened, the experimenter would prod the subject to continue using one of 4 standard prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And you have no other choice. You must go on. These statements were the full extent of the continued efforts to influence participants to comply with the request to deliver punishment. What sort of things did the actor playing the learner say? It began with, ow, and as the intensity increased, moved to actual screams of pain. The learner would eventually say, I'm no longer in the experiment. Let me out. How many participants continued to shock the learner, even after he asked to have it stop? What about after the learner didn't say anything at all to the teacher's questions and only groaned in pain with the next shock? Most people were, and to this day, continue to be surprised by the results. The majority of people, obeyed the experimenter and continued to administer shocks even after the learner became unresponsive. In the original study, this was 26 out of 40, 65%, who went on to administer shocks at a level that was labeled on the machine 450 volts, danger, severe shock. When I present these results to students today, many of them say, oh, I'd never do that, or that would never happen today. Fortunately, Professor Jerry Berger from Santa Clara University took pains to replicate Milgram's experiment. And we now know how much that people have changed since the 1960s. We're certainly wearing different clothes, but, well, let's talk about the study. In a study published in 2009, Berger and his team report a partial replication of Milgram's study. To address ethical concerns that we're very sensitive to now, a clinical psychologist was employed to screen students for anxiety and depression. To be cautious, 38% of the students who were signed up for this experiment were dropped from the study before going further. Berger ran the experiment with 29 men and 41 women. And it included students, but it included some older adults too. They ranged in age from 20 to 81. The average age was 42. The subjects varied in education level as well. In addition to the college students, there were some that only had high school, and there were some with master's degrees. The experiment used the exact same script from Milgram's original work, but Berger made a few changes. He was quicker to stop the experiment and would do so if the subject refused to continue after the 4 standard experimental prompts had all been used, or if the subject made a decision to proceed beyond the 150-volt level. So what did Berger find? Of the men, 67% were prepared to continue beyond the 150-volt level. Of the women, 73% were prepared to continue. So much for the idea that women are always more compassionate than men. Because of Berger's more cautious experimental setup, the results here are a bit more conservative in their estimation of obedience. And some scientists have interpreted this data to mean that people today are more willing to go against authority. But even those critics admit that context continues to be an important and powerful predictor of behavior. Why would so many people be willing to continue the experiment? Further studies by Milgram, who conducted his research at Yale University, helped to describe why. Remember that Milgram's basic experimental setup involves 3 people: the teacher, who is the actual research participant, the learner, who's actually a Confederate pretending to be a volunteer, and the experimenter, who serves as an authority figure. In his further studies, Milgram examined proximity of the learner to the subject. Is there just the voice because the person's in the other room? Is there some visual contact, or are they in the same room actually touching each other? And the proximity of the authority figure. Is the authority figure, the experimenter, present all the time, or does this person leave the room? Proximity made a big difference in both cases. Research participants were less willing to fully comply when the learner was near them and when the authority figure was remote. So being closer to the person you would be doing harm to and being further away from the authority figure asking you to do harm led people to stop sooner. Perhaps it was being at Yale University, an Ivy League institution, that might convey extraordinary levels of authority, and that's what pushed people to continue. To test this idea, Milgram moved the experiment to nearby Bridgeport, Connecticut, and called the study team the Research Associates of Bridgeport, an organization name that was just created for the study. The building used was somewhat run-down commercial building, and the lab was clean but sparsely furnished. And there, the experiment was replicated. Milgram concluded that there was no real difference between obedience levels from Yale University to this other setting. However, the number of people who administered maximum shocks in Bridgeport was 48% versus 65% at Yale. Knowing what we know today about sample sizes and confidence intervals, it's certainly possible that this change made more of a difference than Milgram concluded. At the time, Milgram seemed genuinely surprised that so many people continued to obey, so he emphasized the high levels of obedience in Bridgeport. These classic results generally support the idea that many people will comply with authority figures even when it goes against their own judgment. This effect is diminished when the authority figure is further removed or when the consequences of their action are much more visible to them. In his more recent experiment, Professor Berger tested another condition, having someone else in the room who modeled refusing the authority figure's request. This other person was also a research Confederate. But the participant was told that this person was going to be a teacher in future rounds. As the shocks increased in intensity, this person would say, "I don't know about this," and then, "I don't think I can do this." The Confederate said nothing else and did not, by the script of the experiment, ever make eye contact with the participant. So this amounted to 2 short sentences. Did it make a difference? Not really. The rates of compliance for moving beyond or being willing to move beyond 150 volts were down a little, 55% for men and 68% for women, but the difference is not large enough to be statistically significant with this sample size. So even with one person there modeling resistance to authority, more than half of the participants in Professor Berger's more recent experiment were willing to follow orders and, because they were asked, put another person in pain. Clearly, a context that includes an authority figure is one that is highly prone to elicit compliance. Now, let's extrapolate these findings to contexts where there's no identifiable victim and the authority figure is literally standing over someone's shoulder. Would it be easy for a manager visiting a subordinate's office to stand over his shoulder and look at his spreadsheet and convince him to fake or modify investment records? Or to maybe just inflate a quarterly earnings report by post-dating a particular financial transaction? Given Professors Milgram's and Berger's results, it seems not only possible, it seems likely that the average employee would comply. While some people will have the strength of character to hold true to what they believe is correct, and all of us would like to think we wouldn't be the one to make those changes or fake the data, research suggests that the majority of us would comply. We might not like it, but we use the authority of the person giving orders as an excuse to help ourselves believe we do not have personal responsibility. And therein lies the secret to helping reduce the power of authority. If people are told that they will be personally responsible for their actions, they should be substantially less likely to succumb to pressure from an authority figure. If you want to push yourself to go against authority, remind yourself that at the end of the day, you will be ultimately responsible for what you do. In other words, before you comply with a request from an authority figure, ask yourself, am I comfortable having others know that I did this? Some people, including the famous investor and philanthropist Warren Buffett, refer to this as the newspaper test. How would you feel if there was a story about what you just did on the front page of the local newspaper? Would you be ashamed if people knew? If so, then you should stop and think again before complying. So far, we've talked about scarcity and authority as contextual cues that facilitate influence. Now we move to our third and final cue for this lecture, social proof. Under conditions of uncertainty, we look around us and use other people's actions to guide us. Recall the study mentioned at the opening of this lecture. Professor Milgram, leaving behind his fake shock machine, took his Confederates into the street. When 5 of his Confederates stopped on a busy street and looked up at a building, approximately 80% of the people passing by also looked up. Milgram did this study on 42nd Street in New York City, and there is no reason to expect it wouldn't happen in any crowded area near where you live. People are people, and they pay attention and make sense of the world around them by watching for cues from other people. Social proof can result in some terrible things happening. A famous case in New York City revealed that sometimes people will stand idly by as something terrible happens. In the early morning hours of March 13th, 1964, Catherine Genovese was walking home in Queens, New York, when she was attacked by an assailant with a knife. Subsequent news reports wrote that 38 people heard her screams that night, yet no one called the police. Why did no one call? Is it because people living in the city are apathetic or cruel? The incident and the media coverage that followed sparked lots of dialogue and a host of research studies. In one of these studies, social psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley sought to find the reasons why people did not help Genovese. They asked a research Confederate to slump over and appear passed out on a busy street. Many people just walked by. In another one of their studies, they had a Confederate appear to have an epileptic seizure. When it occurred in front of a single person, that person would help 85% of the time. When it happened in front of 5 people, help would only come 31% of the time. There is clearly no safety in numbers if everyone is looking to see if others will help and everyone fails to act. That's social proof. No one else is helping, so I probably should not help. In these studies, a funny thing happens once one person starts to help. It only takes one person to step in, and then social proof kicks in and others quickly follow. Like Milgram, Latané, and Darley, we're also working in the streets of New York City. Perhaps Canadians are nicer than New Yorkers. A study conducted in Toronto by Professor Abraham Ross found that single bystanders who saw smoke in a room billowing from a door nearby reported it 90% of the time. But again, he was working in Canada. When 2 passerbys were present, now research confederates, were asked to ignore the smoke and not say anything, only 16% of the time did someone speak up. Only 16% of the time. 90% versus 16%, even in Canada. This is the power of social proof. In his book on influence, Bob Cialdini reviews this evidence and offers fantastic advice about how to get aid if you are in trouble in a crowd. To be sure that you get the help you need, Cialdini advises that you reduce all uncertainty and pick a person in the crowd, pointing and saying, "You, sir, in the blue jacket, I need help. Call an ambulance." Once that person who's been picked out and held accountable steps in to help, social proof will kick in and others will follow. But to get the one person you need to move, you do need to create for that person a sense of personal responsibility. So far, we've discussed social proof as it relates to harsh realities of people not providing help if no one else is helping. And it's easy to see social proof and authority operating in cults where people join and stay with groups that have esoteric and even strange beliefs. But how could social proof be used more positively to get someone to do something? Advertisers use it extensively with ads saying 4 out of 5 dentists or 9 out of 10 people, or by claiming that 10 million customers can't be wrong. Bartenders and church greeters use social proof by salting their tip jars and collection plates. If other people are giving, people will reason, then I should give too. So social proof can be used to draw people to new products, new services, and new ideas, such as when a video posted online begins to draw a crowd with many views. When that starts to happen, even more people will click to watch. Cialdini raises an important concern, which is that social proof, like scarcity and authority, involves quick psychological processes that operate outside of our mental control. They are in effect shortcuts that our brain uses to make sense of our social world and make what generally are quite good decisions. But these instantaneous processes can be used against us by unscrupulous people who lie about their authority or make up numbers to make us believe that social proof is there. We should condemn these practices in the strongest terms because they use our own brains against us. There's nothing ethical about manipulating social proof. Salespeople and other influence artists should make the sale on the strength of the arguments in their products, not on tricks, ploys, or lies. In this lecture, we have discussed 3 context features that have strong effects on influence: scarcity, authority, and social proof. Although each can occur naturally, the examples used in this lecture should make it clear that agents sometimes alter contexts as a way to improve their chances of successful influence. Whether they occur as context or tactic, it's helpful for you to understand how these may be affecting your decisions and behavior outside of your awareness. To help you explore these ideas further, let me propose 2 activities that can help you better understand the power that context has over us all. First, sit in public and watch people waiting in line at a store. Watch their behavior and consider the level of conformity and the forces that create it. What percent of people do you notice who don't mimic others? What percent seem willing to break outside the lines and not follow what others are doing? What percent are doing exactly what the people around them are doing? Take a look. The second thing I would encourage you to try is to apply the scarcity tactic the next time you're going to buy a big ticket item. So the next time you're looking to buy a car, for example, do a lot of research. Reach out via the email, your email account or the web to a few different car dealers. Find out if they have what you'd like to buy in stock and find out what kind of deal you could get. Then visit the dealership where you would really prefer to buy. Get to know the salesperson. When the salesperson moves in for the close, you could simply say, I would like to buy from you, but I've already heard from 3 other dealers who are interested in my business. I only have so much time to continue to look into who can offer the best deal. What is your best offer that you can make to me today? At this point, you've argued that your business, your time, is scarce. A salesperson who wants the sale should move at this point to make you an offer that will appeal. In this lecture, we've finished our tour of the ADDIC model, starting with agent and here ending with context. In the next lecture, we'll take up more specific applications of influence, beginning with impression management that occurs in many work settings like the employment interview. If you've always wondered about the best way to ace an interview, then join me for the next lecture to find out.